From the Arctic to the forests of Europe and the mountains of Asia, Western agents are parachuted into enemy territory. A hidden war. From a base in the Mediterranean, American flying boats take off on secret missions.
A civilian would come out and say, well, you know, you're on for a mission sometime in the next 24 hours. He wouldn't tell us what it was.
They skim the treetops, dropping partisans behind enemy lines.
Whenever the moon was out, we were gone. We were like werewolves.
As soon as an agent lands, a merciless hunt begins. Many would be captured after just a few hours, unless they killed themselves first.
If you were caught, the only use for your pistol was to stick it in your mouth.
To rescue agents in the field, hair-raising techniques are developed.
I was accused of trying to emulate James Bond, although James Bond hadn't yet done this.
Cloak and dagger operations in the Eastern Bloc, one of the best-kept secrets of the Cold War. (1944), World War II. The Allies are preparing the D-Day landings. A secret American unit based in England provides support to resistance groups in occupied Europe. Its code name is Carpetbagger.
It was a group that was set up to fly supplies and underground and people into occupied areas. It was a part of the OSS.
The OSS, precursors of the CIA. They use the special unit as a kind of air courier service. It starts as a stopgap operation. It becomes a vital secret weapon.
We carried money, we carried munitions, we carried people, whatever they needed.
London. The OSS recruits agents among the thousands of refugees from occupied Europe fighting for the Allied cause. They've escaped the Nazis. Now they want to return home to fight them. They're gathered in training camps in England. One of the largest contingents is from Poland.
Port lotniczo-centralny.
Port lotniczo-centralny.
Die Luftwaffe.
Die Luftwaffe.
Broń lotnicza.
Broń lotnicza.
In this film made by the US Secret Services, future spies, among them French, Dutch and Scandinavians, are taught the tricks of the trade. They will be fighting against Nazi Germany for the liberation of their homelands. They will soon be dropped behind enemy lines in the greatest secrecy. The pilots who fly them know nothing about their passengers.
Then we would taxi out on the runway just before we get to the takeoff runway. They would bring these people out and put them in the airplane. I never got to see any of them. They didn't give us much information because if we were shot down, they didn't want us to know.
Everyone is told only what he needs to know to fulfill his mission. Not even British anti-aircraft defenses are informed of the flights.
When I flew across the channel into France or wherever, I flew at about 500 or 600 feet, not over that. In fact, we got a little lower than that at times. You could see the prop wash bringing the water up. Any of the boats that were going up and down the channel, whether they were enemy boats or our boats, we had no way of telling them we were Americans, and they would automatically open up on us. So we flew low and fast.
Once across the English Channel, they fly at treetop level. And when they reach the drop zone, they have to ensure the right people are waiting for them.
All we had was lights. We had a light at one end of the field and a light at the opposite end of the field with a light in the middle, which gave us a light signal. If they didn't give us a right signal, we didn't drop.
Carpetbagger is a success story still shrouded in secrecy. It's the mother of all aerial secret agent operations. (1945). Victory in World War II. The Americans dismantled their foreign intelligence services. At exactly the wrong moment. For Europe has been cut in half. The nations of Eastern Europe are once again occupied, this time by their Soviet liberators. But internal resistance grows. During the war, Stalin had been Uncle Joe to the Allies. Now his image changes. He becomes the merciless dictator bent on world domination. In the East, nationalist resistance groups quickly emerge. Many fought against the Soviets even during the war. Some had even collaborated with the Nazis. The Soviets brand them bandits and terrorists. But in the West, they're now hailed as freedom fighters. Their goal is the independence they've scarcely enjoyed. Different national groups come together to fight the common enemy. Vasil Kuk was deputy leader of the Ukrainian nationalists.
We
weren't just interested in the liberation of the Ukrainian people, but in the freedom of all subject peoples in the Soviet Union. So, there were foreign units in the Ukrainian rebel army as early as 1943 and 44, from Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. We all asked the same question. Didn't the creation of an independent Ukrainian state also mean the fall of the Soviet Union?
And the West will support them. They will use anyone who opposes the Soviets. In 1949, the British start Operation Jungle. They send ex-German officer Hans Helmut Klose in a converted German speedboat to land agents on the Baltic coast. Soon, agents and arms are being sent in to northern, central and southern Europe. Support for the resistance movements becomes a serious problem for the Soviets.
These Allied operations certainly had a considerable degree of success. And for a period of more than 10 years after the end of World War II, the KGB were unable to capture all the partisans in the Ukraine and the Baltic republics. They were very active and killed a very large number of Red Army, militia and KGB members.
Nearly 80,000 are killed by the partisans. In Athens, the newly formed CIA takes on Polish pilots from the Royal Air Force to drop agents behind communist lines. Many of them are deployed from Greek airfields. Other Polish pilots are sent to bases in Germany.
The British had no more use for them as air crews, and they had no jobs. And at that time, the Russians were coming in, and they really couldn't go home. So they were really men without a country and no jobs. And we offered them good, very good salaries.
The Poles practice extreme low-level flight, just like in Operation Carpetbagger.
We would train them on low-level missions over, and whenever the moon was out, at full moon, we were gone. We were like werewolves. And
Together, the CIA and the US Air Force fly in more than 2,000 agents in support of resistance movements. The Soviet Union has little radar. Its borders are protected only by ancient acoustic direction finders. Some of these agents will never be caught. As the CIA says, the best agents are the ones you never hear about. They simply disappear. Some even infiltrate the Soviet hierarchy. KGB agent hunter Stanislav Lekarev.
They just got on the train. Of course, they had money, weapons, and a radio with them. Then they traveled east, beyond the Urals, to Lake Baikal.
Workers are urgently needed here, and you can get ahead quickly, even without papers. Clever agents destroy their forged documents.
They joined the party, and they made a career. Spies really did make it to second or third party secretary.
But many are less successful. Most of these agents are recruited in Germany among former Soviet slave workers and prisoners of war.
I just wanted to get back to the Soviet Union. Someone said to me, "You know us, come on, stay with us." But that meant I had to get involved. The Americans were behind the whole thing.
White Russians like Ostrikov are trained in Germany, turned into CIA agents.
They threatened me. They said, if I didn't fly out there, I'd get a bullet in my head. I said, I'm not going to shoot at White Russians.
A few days after reaching White Russia, Ostrikov is captured, like most agents.
They came up to me at the station and said, "Right, let's have a look what someone like you is carrying." Well, I went with them. It soon became clear that they were from the KGB.
In fact, Ostrikov is lucky. The death penalty has been abolished in the Soviet Union. He survives 23 years in a prison camp. But his fate is by no means unique. The training units in Germany are riddled with Soviet double agents. They pass on details of all the missions to Moscow.
We had the photos of the agents, their dates and places of birth, and sometimes even the dates and the places where they were going to be dropped.
But the agents have been given a secret weapon. Their bicycles are parachuted down with them. Riding them, they can sometimes outpace their would-be captors. In this KGB training film, however, the bike fails to do the trick. The film shows the urgency of immobilizing the agent before he has time to bite on his cyanide pill. Captured agents expect to be tortured, but they're well treated. Many change sides and agree to work for the Soviets. Then they and their equipment are presented to the media.
Espionage, sabotage, murder of civilians. That's what all these things were to be used for. One of the most important weapons in the KGB's arsenal was propaganda, with which we were able to give the impression that no enemy was safe on our territory. No agent could escape. When a parachutist was captured, it was all over the papers and the newsreels. Perhaps that's how the impression arose that all our operations worked, while the Americans bungled everything.
But the propaganda isn't one-sided. The Americans are packing resources into their own glossy version of the Cold War.
This is the story of a man whom the communists called traitor. Traitor because he dared to speak of freedom. Radio Free Europe stations are an operation of private American citizens. These are tough, slugging stations pounding through your Iron Curtain, firing the big truth to specific towns and cities. A crusade that will build a network of freedom stations you'll never jam, riddling your Iron Curtain with more and more programs of truth until finally they'll undermine your puppet tyranny and force you to give freedom to your 80 million prisoners.
These films, on both sides, are made not to convert the enemy, but to convince the home population. So the Russians portray the CIA as trigger-happy but stupid Chicago gangsters.
These are two-way mirrors. It's hardly the latest spy technology, but the CIA still insist on using them.
But the CIA are anything but stupid. These are the first pictures ever broadcast of the US Air Force's secret 580th Squadron. Their B-29s fly agents and supplies into Russia and the Soviet satellite states. Later, they will also fly into the Middle East and Central Asia. The giant B-29s are ideal. They combine a huge payload with phenomenal range to Siberia and back. Not that the squadron's pilots ever talk about their missions, not even to each other.
The crew chief walked over to the aircraft commander and said, where you been? He says, everywhere, here, there, and everywhere. Where did you land? We didn't land. They had been flying for the 20 hours.
But there's always a risk one of their planes could be shot down. So they train to rescue their crews behind enemy lines. For the rescue missions, they choose flying boats. They can operate on land, on water, or even on snow. As this US training film shows, the same techniques can also be used to rescue agents in the field or to pluck defectors from behind enemy lines. They practice till they can land in the length of a football field and take off again using rockets.
The mission that I was involved in was getting a family out of the Soviet Union.
It's 1956. Ken Shook pilots his Grumman Albatross out of Tehran as far as the Caspian Sea, deep inside the Soviet Union. He lands beside a motorboat after receiving the correct recognition signals. It's a smuggler's boat, but on this occasion, the illicit cargo is a couple with their 2 children.
They were probably from Germany and involved in the space program.
Within hours, his passengers are on their way to a new life in the USA. Meanwhile, in Southeast Asia, the Cold War has been hotting up. North Korea, with its Soviet weapons, has invaded the South. In 1950, the United States and its allies intervene.
If one looks at the status of just the Army at the outbreak of the Korean War, you're startled. How could we be so ill-prepared?
At first, the Americans are pushed back, deep into South Korea. A massive seaborne invasion of the North is meant to turn the communist tide. Then 400,000 Chinese troops cross the border into Korea. More than 3 million civilians die in this cruelest of conflicts. More napalm is dropped in 3 years in Korea than in the entire Vietnam War. The Americans set up a new unit for secret agent operations. It's the 581st Squadron. For For the first time, they use helicopters for some of their missions. Bob Sullivan is one of the pilots.
The 581st had several different missions. The first one, of course, was psychological warfare, which is the way the air resupply communications of outfits were presented. Our second mission was to back up rescue when they had a helicopter problem.
Psychological warfare, resupply, and communication means delivering agents behind the lines. A war where both sides speak the same language and look the same, and soldiers and peasants can barely be distinguished, should offer unlimited potential for deploying secret agents. Doug Dillard is in charge of agent operations in Korea. He's kept busy.
I flew 115 missions, and almost every night during that period of time, there were 2, 3, or 4 aircraft that went out on these missions. And it might be one agent on one aircraft, it may be an agent team or 6, 8, 10, or 12. If you think about that, over that extended period of time, we're talking about many people. I don't have an exact figure, but I would have to say several thousand.
Dropping and supplying the agents becomes such a large-scale operation that the CIA invent fake commercial airlines to share the workload with the Air Force. But not all runs smoothly. One night, a Curtiss C-46 commando fails to return from a mission.
When I got back from my mission, we ended operations. They said, we lost the 46. And I said, what the hell happened? He said, well, we don't know. It just went off the air. And we've gotten no information, so we know something happened to it.
A surveillance plane soon picks up radio traffic in North Korea.
The Chinese radio was intercepted, where they were reporting the loss of that plane, the crash, and the recovery of some prisoners and bodies from the plane.
The Americans pieced together the details.
We knew that many of the people we were dropping were at best double agents. Sometimes they were total North Koreans. But you couldn't tell a North Korean from a South Korean without a program.
Soon, everyone knows what has happened.
As the agents went out the door, they'd flip grenades back into the airplane.
As soon as we found out what happened, with subsequent missions, we always would not let the agent put a clip or ammunition in his weapon. It was always put in either a bag or was put in his clothing, and the clothing covered over so he couldn't have access to it. And same way with grenades.
Dropping agents by helicopter is also dangerous.
We turned up the valley where the intelligence people told us there would be nothing but farmers. And you're looking down on this thing, and the hills are covered with camouflage netting. And under the camouflage netting is all these crates and boxes and things. There's about a regiment of troops in that valley. And nobody liked us to be in there. And they were shooting all kinds of stuff at us. And I saw something go under the tail boom that I swear was that round. It was amazing, a big ball of fire. I was really impressed. Really, they chased us out of there, because the helicopter wasn't going to survive in there, there's no question about it.
They need to find a way to extract agents and down crews fast, without having to land. So the Air Force develops a new rescue system. It uses a gantry, rather like that used by the first airmail services to pick up mail bags without touching down. The plane flies low towards the target, and its hook grabs the stretched cable, lifting the payload off the ground.
We'd have the plane come in and grab a sack of sand, the equivalent of the weight of a man, and I shot in slow motion how the bag went straight up into the air and then traveled horizontally for a ways and went way above the aircraft and come way down. And if the aircraft hadn't gained enough altitude, the bag would come down and hit the ground. Yeah, that was the problem, because if that was a person, of course, they'd be killed instantly.
Not a happy prospect. So the next tests are carried out with sheep. The acceleration at the moment of pickup is more than 9G. Jerry Sims is a US Air Force cameraman. He films the tests for later analysis. Astonishingly, the sheep survives unhurt. It's time to try it out on a human being.
They were laid flat on the ground and with stuff, and so they would collect them in the middle like that, you know, like that, and take them up. But they didn't have enough support for their stomach and the soft tissues in the body, and they killed, 1 or 2 of them died.
The technique is adapted. This is the decisive test. By using a belt to pull the knees into the chest, they hope to prevent the intestines being ripped out. The tension mounts. This could so easily be a suicide mission. For a moment, it's not clear whether it's worked. But then, over time, the system is perfected. Even the retrieval into the plane works amazingly well.
It looks pretty frightening, because it is frightening. And when we decided to distribute this in Korea, they needed a film so that pilots would try it. Because sometimes one would think that maybe it'd be better just to be captured than to be killed being pulled up into a plane.
So it works. But being scooped up at 9G and dragged by the plane in a high-speed climb remains a problem. Even for the pilots, who are meant to carry it out.
I know I was asked about it one time, and my answer was, I don't know whether I'd be picking up a man or a mountain, and I would prefer not to even try it.
Then, in 1953, a B-29 is shot down on a bombing mission over North Korea. The crew managed to bail out, and they've been able to radio their position back to base. Escaping the North Koreans is now the priority for the crew. They hide in remote countryside until they're spotted by US search planes. Then they can be supported from the air.
We dropped supplies and we dropped a radio. They were in contact with them, and they felt like they could go in and pick them up with what we called it the snatch crew.
But there's something suspicious about the radio messages.
They were a little worried that they might be compromised, and so I happened to hear the conversation one day about it, and I said, well, the co-pilot in that airplane was a classmate of mine, and I can give you some questions to ask him that only he could answer. And they said, better than that, you're going north and you're going to ask him.
The co-pilot answers the questions correctly.
And he said, "Oh man, we're alive, come get us." So I recognized his voice even.
But the downed crew are now in the hands of the North Koreans. The Americans start the rescue mission. They drop off the retrieval system. Then the rescue team get the final okay.
As they were making their pass, the pilot kept telling the ground, "I can't see the station. I can't see the station."
They're flying into a North Korean trap.
They were below the ground level on 3 sides. They shot down on them from above. They shot into them from the front. They shot up at them from down below. And how they got out of there, I don't know. They were shot up pretty good.
U.S. fighters escorting the rescue plane managed to subdue the North Korean fire. The rescue plane is badly damaged, but manages to escape. The first proxy war of the superpowers ends with a ceasefire along the original borders. Even today, North and South Korea are still officially at war. The veterans of the conflict return to civilian life. For Shep Johnson, it means going back to his mother's farm in Montana.
My brother just come down where I was feeding cows and advised me that if I wanted to, I could get a better job with the smoke jumpers, and I told him that he was nuts.
The smoke jumpers are a special unit of firefighters who parachute into remote mountain areas in the USA to put out forest fires. After a moment's doubt, Shep Johnson decides to give it a go. Training with the smoke jumpers is like being with an elite military unit, except that these young men have to learn to act entirely independently. When they jump, they're completely alone and can ask no one for orders. They have a protective suit that allows them to jump straight into trees without being injured.
I like jumping. It was pretty tough starting out, you know. It was pretty well, even though I'd been through the Korean War and stuff like this, smoke jumping or jumping out of an airplane is still a little bit exciting.
If they do land in a tree or on steep rocks, they're trained to abseil down to the ground. Once they're down, the tough part starts.
We had to stay on there 24 hours after we had the last smoke to make sure it was out. And if you ever had a repeater, you were finished. You might as well pack your bags. You were done.
It isn't long before the smoke jumpers come to the attention of a very different organization.
Of course, the CIA, you didn't call them, they called you.
Toby Scott and Shep Johnson become CIA parachute instructors at Camp Hale, Colorado. At this training area for mountain and cold weather warfare, they're preparing volunteers to fight in the Himalayas. During the Korean War, China invaded the neighboring state of Tibet. This peaceful country with no real army is ruled by a spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama. It's an easy victory for the Chinese. For Tibetans, it means a harsh occupation continuing to this day. The last desperate resistance of a few monks defying their own prohibition against violence is soon broken. Tibet, a country as big as Western Europe, is annexed. Only the Khampa, a mountain people with a warrior tradition, are still holding out. The CIA decides to support them. Many Khampa escape to India and are recruited as guerrillas. The CIA trains them at Camp Hale.
The Tibetans, I was really impressed with them. They were honest. They worked hard. They weren't as physically able to do things as we were. They weren't as big. And some of them were old-timers. Some of them weren't kids, you know. I mean, they were real troops, and we all were, we were proud to work with them, and they appreciated us helping them, you could tell.
Toby Scott and Shep Johnson train them as well as they can, but they know it's pointless. The Tibetan guerrillas can do little against the Chinese forces occupying their country.
Training the guys was an experience. They were all good people. You just learned to love them. That's all there was to it. And you had to love them for the fact that they were training to go in someplace and they'd never survive. You knew that yourself. How could they?
The CIA continue to drop agents into the mountains of Tibet, but the prospect becomes more and more hopeless. The guerrillas launch suicide attacks. Finally, the Dalai Lama himself escapes to India and asks them to end the senseless sacrifice.
You know, they'd already lost Tibet anyway, and then we knew they went in as guerrilla fighters just to harass the Chinese, you know. No.
When the Dalai Lama escapes over the mountains to India, the CIA have to cancel their own rescue plan. They were going to use a brand new device, the Skyhook. It's never been used in action. A balloon is attached by an elastic cable to the harness of the person to be rescued. The rescue plane aims at the cable, catches it between two arms on its nose, and gently pulls the person into the sky.
The pickup was very interesting. The feeling is like a slight kick in the pants when the plane hits the balloon 500 feet up. And you're lifted up very slowly for the first 10 meters.
But in the first trials, getting back into the plane caused Leshak some terrifying moments.
There was some buffeting as I was being pulled into the bomb bay, and I had to put my arms out to keep from hitting the radome and the antenna, which was a sharp device hanging downward, which would have impaled me.
After this test, the entrance hatch was moved to the tail of the aircraft. Now Leshak is told to prepare for a deployment in the Arctic. Since the first nuclear submarines entered service in 1955, the North Pole has been one of the most important theaters of the Cold War. Beneath the ice sheet, submarines can operate in complete secrecy and emerge to fire their missiles through cracks in the ice. And this is where the two superpowers come closer than anywhere else. Both the US and the USSR have polar research bases, which have taken on supreme military importance. The Americans have turned Greenland into an unsinkable aircraft carrier. By 1962, they've built Camp Century, an entire town on the ice. After a nuclear attack on the US, this small town with its 200 inhabitants will be the operations center for a nuclear counterattack. They even build in a miniature nuclear power plant. Nobody worries about the dangers of radiation from it. They're only concerned about their own and the enemy's bombs. The Americans are new to Arctic research, unlike the Soviets. They now plan a whole series of ice stations to collect data. Many of their scientists are also secret servicemen. Their job is to detect submarines by their engine sounds. They start with their own submarines.
We established a listening array of hydrophones And this was going to be used for tracking the nuclear submarine Sargo, which had a number of patrols that went beneath the ice island.
Ice islands are gigantic icebergs, the most solid ground among the sea ice, which is constantly torn apart by the shifting currents. The Soviets often used them as a base for their research stations. Yevgeny Yevseyev was a Soviet research scientist.
You could use almost all our research for military purposes, even the weather forecasts.
These ice islands drift with the currents along the enemy's coastline, so both sides use their civilian stations for espionage, like listening to secret radio communications. Detecting submarines is a full-time activity. It's vitally important to be able to locate the enemy under the ice. But the sea ice in the Arctic is under so much pressure from the currents that it regularly splits. And sometimes these cracks cut straight across the ice islands, destroying the landing strips for the supply planes. Then the stations must be evacuated at once.
It became an operation very close to panic to get all the people off before it could no longer be supported by air.
Leshak suggests to his superiors in Washington that they inspect Soviet station NP-8, which has just been abandoned. The plan is for 2 Secret Service agents to parachute to the base and find out what the Soviets have been doing there. But right from the beginning, the operation hits snags. Even though its position is known, and there are 3 specialist polar navigators on board, the team simply can't locate NP-8.
To find an item out there, it isn't like trying to find San Francisco. You just got miles and miles and miles of ice.
After days of searching, the ice station appears out of the haze. Leshak and Smith prepare to jump.
The crew opened the side door of the C-130 in preparation to let us jump out, and Major Smith looked at it and said, "No, that isn't the station, that's my old station. I recognize the configuration of it."
Finally, the search plane is withdrawn. In exchange, the CIA supply an ancient, creaking Flying Fortress bomber with smoke jumper Toby Scott on board to operate the Skyhook. A submarine hunter aircraft and US Navy navigators join in the search. After more long days in the air, Soviet research station North Pole 8 comes into view. And these are pictures of the actual mission. Leshak jumps.
I landed in a bank of snow. It was the softest landing I've ever made. It was just perfect.
Their equipment is parachuted after them. It too makes a perfect landing.
They waggled the wings of the B-17, and frankly, there's nothing quite as exciting as the sound of those 4 reciprocating engines as they roar over your head. And moments later, we were on our own.
Scott and Leshak start investigating the Soviet station. They soon find signs of acoustic experiments. Microphone cables lead out of a hut through a hole in the ice, deep into the polar ocean.
Everything showed an emergency evacuation, that everyone was in a great rush to go, and because the aircraft were running out of time when they could use the runway.
Cracks and ice debris are an occupational hazard on the ice islands, especially in summer.
A crack opened up right under the sauna, and the duty officer came to the three people who were washing themselves and said, "Boys, the crack has moved under the sauna. We'll go and look and see if there's any risk we'll fall in. Is it more or less than half over the edge?" And when they heard that it was less than half, they calmly carried on washing.
Smith and Leszak also examine the private belongings on the station and keep some as souvenirs. In their haste to leave, the Russians have even left a strip of negatives in their photographic enlarger. Plenty of what they find is familiar, but a lot is different from life on an American ice station. And they jump to the wrong conclusion about one or two things.
What they had was, carcasses. There was many sides of beef. It looks like there were sides of dog there too, husky dogs, but who knows?
That's not true. That can't be true. I don't know if the final shift had to kill the dogs. But one thing is sure. We don't eat dogs. We're not Chinese.
In fact, the huskies are there principally as an early warning system against polar bears. They are the real daily threat to the scientists. But what were Yevseyev and his colleagues really up to on NP8? What military experiments were carried out there?
It appears that they began to seriously think about nuclear submarines under the Arctic Ocean, and certainly were considering using these stations for clandestine listening stations for electronic emissions.
I don't see it like that. It wasn't like that. I insist it was pure science. Pure science.
It wasn't. Other scientists on NP8 have admitted carrying out experiments in submarine detection. They researched the use of ice islands as bases for long-range Soviet bombers. And they developed acoustic navigation systems for submarines.
There was the feeling that, yes, this is clear espionage, and yes, it is also viewing the work of people very much like ourselves.
The mission is a success, but now the agents wait day after day for the pickup aircraft. Once again, they're having trouble finding the ice station. And when they find it, they face 100-kilometer-an-hour winds.
When you saw that smoke going right along the ice, that's the first thing I thought. I said, boy, this is that reminded me kind of like Edwards Air Force Base when we went up there and did one there, and it was real windy, and we bounced it off the ground.
They must pick up their hardware from the Russian base first. If this doesn't work, there's no way the agents will get off the ice. It works. Then it's Leszak's turn. Waiting on the ice, he inflates his balloon.
To my horror, I recognize that with the winds aloft, the pull on the line was enough to cause me to slide across the ice, even in the sitting position. I immediately started to claw a handhold into the ice. Ultimately, the plane did make contact. I felt the shock of the plane hitting it. You'll see me flailing around like a fish in distress. on the end of a line. In fact, I was a fish in distress.
Then the plane goes round again, and Smith, too, is dragged into the aircraft.
Boy, when we got done with that, I'll tell you, there's a lot of relief right there in that airplane. Everybody was sure relieved and happy. Finally got it done.
The CIA mission commander is on board.
He clicked the 2 locks on his attaché case, and the only thing in the attaché case was a bottle of VAT 69 scotch. And he said something like, "Are you guys interested?"
They are, as the poor focus of the subsequent pictures proves. Operation Cold Feet is a resounding success. For the management of the mission and for the data secured, Leonard Leshak is awarded the Legion of Merit. But this being the CIA, he's not allowed to wear it, and the mission stays top secret. 3 years later, the Skyhook system is used in a James Bond film.
James Bond. We all really wanted to be like him, even us Soviet agents.
Looking back, Cold War espionage seems like a superpower game played out by the secret services. But it was deadly serious, and it could have turned out differently. Secret drops and secret pickups. Infiltrations, surveillance. Then as now, it's the operations we don't hear about that are the successful ones. All these techniques are still in use today, perhaps in different parts of the world, against different adversaries.